After eating with his family in the dining room of the large country estate, Jamie's father allowed his son to retire to his room with his new collectible. Even though Paolo, the Gibsons' house chef, had prepared Jamie's favorite dish, medium-rare rump steak in pepper sauce with fried potatoes, to top off this special day, Jamie was overflowing with anticipation. Finally he could devote himself to the Jack-in-the-Box without his little sister bursting into tears or anyone else being offended by the jester's hideous appearance. Jamie sat on the edge of his bed and looked at the black box that sat on the glass dessert table next to him. Not far from the boy, Cherry was lying on the blanket and playing with a small plush panda. Like every evening, the poodle had followed the boy to his room to spend some time with him. After a few quick strokes, Jamie turned his attention to the black box with the Jack-in-the-Box, whereupon Cherry looked for something else to do. Thoughtfully, Jamie picked up the box, which was made of an unknown material. What had motivated him to choose this small box as his prize? It had been impossible for him to know what it contained. It couldn't have been mere curiosity. Rather, Jamie believed that something had unconsciously guided his decision. Maybe it was simply the instinct of a collector that let Jamie choose the little black box. Whatever the case, he had come into possession of a unique curiosity that couldn't be found in any toy or comic book store. Grinning in anticipation, he pressed the silver button on the side of the box, whereupon its lid popped open and the gruesome jester figure jumped out. Again there was that quiet giggle that probably gave everyone listening goosebumps. "Awesome," Jamie said contentedly to himself. "The Jack-in-the-Box is really the hottest thing I've ever had." Suddenly Cherry, who let go of the plush panda, jumped up from the folded blanket. The otherwise well-behaved poodle lady shifted her front legs and took a defensive position. Growling, she pulled back her lips, revealing the sharp teeth of her jaw. It seemed as if she felt threatened by the presence of the macabre Jack-in-the-Box. "Hey Cherry, what's wrong, sweetie?" Jamie blurted out. The growl turned into hostile barking. Jamie noticed Cherry staring in the Jack-in-the-Box's direction. "No, not you too." Rolling his eyes, Jamie shook his head. "Even a dog can't stand the Jack-in-the-Box." Admittedly, the fool doesn't exactly have a face to love, but that's exactly what made him special. Cherry became more and more upset. Barking, she turned in a circle and prepared to attack the Jack-in-the-Box. This behavior didn't fit with the poodle lady's otherwise friendly nature. It seemed as if something was emanating from the Jack-in-the-Box, awakening a hidden instinct in Cherry and infuriating her. Jamie quickly pushed the jester figure back into the box and put it back on the bedside table. "What's wrong with you, my darling?" the boy asked as he bent his upper body down. "Calm down. This is just a figure, it jumps out of the box when you press the button. My whole room is full of figures, they don't upset you." After a short while, Cherry stopped barking. She became calmer, but her heart was still racing and her breathing was uneven. Jamie stood up from the edge of the bed and lifted Cherry into his arms. He nuzzled his face into her frizzy fur, showing her that he cared for her. In return, Cherry licked his left cheek. "You just had me really worried," Jamie said in a gentle voice. "I'm going to ask Dad if it would be okay if I took you on a little tour of the property." Jamie left his room with Cherry in his arms. He found his parents sitting in the living room and briefly told them what had happened. Finally, Jamie managed to persuade his father to let Cherry take a few minutes for a walk around the property that belonged to the house, which was surrounded by security fences. As they walked across the lawn lined with carefully trimmed trees, Cherry was her old self again. The horrible Jack-in-the-Box seemed forgotten to them. Jamie, on the other hand, felt an uneasy feeling rising from the pit of his stomach that made him swallow. After Jamie returned from the evening walk with Cherry, he delivered the poodle to his parents in the living room and then went alone to his room. His first glance fell on the black box on the glass nightstand. The joyful lightheartedness with which he had previously viewed this thing had disappeared to some extent. Was the item just harmless horror fun? Cherry's strange behavior caused Jamie to have doubts for the first time. He even briefly considered whether he should throw the box with the Jack-in-the-Box in the trash. However, his collector's heart resisted this. Finally, Jamie shook his head decisively. Surely Cherry had just had a bad moment, he thought to himself. Even animals can overreact. The Jack-in-the-Box was an unusual toy that posed no threat whatsoever. Without picking up the box again, Jamie got ready for bed. When the boy was in his pajamas, he opened the blanket and prepared it for the night. Then Jamie turned on the bedside lamp and lay down in his bed. There was a Guardians of the Galaxy comic book on the mattress next to his pillow, which Jamie picked up to read. Just like every evening, shortly after 9 p.m., his mother came in to kiss her son goodnight and tell him to turn off the light and go to sleep. As Ellen Gibson was about to leave the nursery, Jamie suddenly sat up straight. "Mom," he said. His mother turned to him, smiling. "Do you believe that an object, for example a figure, can be evil?" A thoughtful expression came over Ellen Gibson's face. "You mean like a voodoo doll where needles are inserted to harm a victim?" "Yeah, basically," Jamie replied. "I rather think that a voodoo doll was a kind of medium with the help of which a person causes evil mischief. I find it unlikely that there is anything evil about a dead confession. Evil can only be something that is used for evil purposes." Ellen tilted her head and looked at Jamie questioningly. "Why are you asking me such a thing?" Jamie scratched the back of his head in thought. "It's because of Cherry. Her behavior was just so strange. I've never seen her so upset before. While I was walking, it occurred to me that there was something wrong with the Jack-in-the-Box." "You mean perhaps the ghastly fool is imbued with a secret malevolent life force," replied Ellen Gibson. She had to smile at her own words. "Have you secretly watched any horror films that you're far too young for? We're not talking about Puppet Master or Chucky the Killer Puppet here. In reality there is no such thing. Or have you ever looked? Maybe there is also a switch for a bad and a good attitude, as was the case with the crusty doll in that Treehouse of Horror episode of The Simpsons. Jokes aside. Similar to your sister with the giant teddy, you chose a prize that corresponded to your wishes. You just love monsters, so you shouldn't take too much offense at the reactions of those around you." "But that's just it," replied Jamie. "When I chose the box, I couldn't have known that it contained the Jack-in-the-Box. Then it was just your instinct for an unusual collector's item. Now that's good. Turn off the lights, sleep well and no nightmares." Ellen Gibson left her son's room before he could say anything else to her. Sighing, Jamie puts his comic aside. He turned off the light of his bedside lamp, and the darkness of a young night entered the room. Jamie lay down. He lay awake on his back for a few more minutes. After a while his eyes adjusted to the night darkness and he stared up at the ceiling. Finally he rolled over to sleep. Jamie closed his eyelids and fell asleep a few seconds later. A foreign force acting on him from outside ensured that the boy did not wake up until the next morning. It happened around midnight when a shaking from within shook the black box. The sudden noise didn't wake Jamie. Hardly anything could have woken the boy from his deep sleep. After the box lid popped open, the shaking stopped again. This time the jester figure was not catapulted out by the spring. Instead, two tiny gray hands appeared at the edges, holding up the figure of the Jack-in-the-Box. In the darkness of the nighttime children's room, the devilish fool's face furtively looked around. The figure's eyes that came to life narrowed as they settled on the sleeping boy. When he didn't move, the fool's mouth twisted into a diabolical grin. The sleeping spell that was on Jamie was taking full effect. Grinning cynically, the miniature fool pulled himself further up the edge of the small box. Where his torso had previously been attached to a metal spring, he had now grown legs, one of which he swung over the edge of the box. Like his other leg, it was covered in tights typical of the late Middle Ages, the color of which matched the rest of the jester's costume. After the Jack-in-the-Box had come to life and swung its second leg out of the box, it climbed onto the glass surface of the bedside table. Letting out a gurgle coming from his throat, he jumped almost half a meter down, where the fool landed with both feet on the carpeted floor of the children's room. Down here. His night-sighted eyes looked around carefully once more. The room made a tidy impression. There were just a few things lying around under the bed, like crayons and rubber toys. There were no major obstacles for the jack-in-the-box on his way to the door. The demonic fool set off with the task he had in mind for that night. Shortly afterwards he stood in front of the door to the room, the handle of which was out of his reach. But for a creature created with black magic, an unlocked door posed no serious obstacle. From the lips of the jack-in-the-box came the murmur of a few unholy words, the force of which was directed towards the room door. Suddenly the door handle was pushed down as if by magic. With a jerk, the door swung open a little way into the interior of the room, large enough for the fool to easily reach the hallway behind. Clenching his tiny hands into fists, the jack-in-the-box summoned all his courage and ran out into the spacious corridor, which was lined with a red carpet. For a being whose purpose of existence served only evil purposes, the emergence of one's own feelings of fear could not play a role. All that mattered to the fool that night was his murderous mission. Despite his small size, he continued undaunted. He paused behind the doorway to Jamie's room to look carefully in both directions. The boy's room was near the end of the corridor. There were no other doors to the right. Only a small window gaped in the back wall, letting in pale moonlight. A circumstance that made it easier to decide which direction the fool should take from Jamie's room. Furthermore, a kind of inner instinct guided the demon jack-in-the-box that allowed him to locate his victims. So he crept along the manor house hallway at night. The next door followed a few meters away. Unlike Jamie's bedroom door, this one was open. The fool surreptitiously paused behind the doorframe to peer into the room beyond. The room was about the same size as the boy's, but decorated completely differently. On the pink-painted walls were several posters depicting princesses from Disney films. A nightlight burning in a socket revealed further details with its dim light. Lying in the bed in front of a drawn curtain at the back of the room was the figure of a little girl. A huge button-eyed teddy bear sat on a wooden chair a short distance from the bed. It looked like the oversized stuffed animal was watching over the sleeping child, who was Jamie's little sister. Like her brother, Kathy slept particularly soundly that night. Nothing would wake the girl up so easily, not even the screams that echoed through the house. Like her brother, Kathy slept particularly soundly that night. Nothing would wake the girl up so easily, not even the screams that echoed through the house. Like her brother, Kathy slept particularly soundly that night. Nothing would wake the girl up so easily, not even the screams that echoed through the house. After a short period of observation, the fool turned away from the sleeping child to continue creeping down the hallway. The subsequent doors, all on the same side of the wall, were all locked. Activating his ability that made the fool feel the beating of hearts and the breathing of lungs, he stopped at each door to listen. He couldn't see any signs of life behind any of the doors. Whatever might be hiding in these rooms, no one was in them at the moment. After listening at the last door in the row, the jack-in-the-box crept a little further along the red carpet. He bared his sharp fangs in frustration. The cottage property was large and the creature hoped that the Gibsons had their bedroom on the same floor as their children. In addition to the fact that the search for his victims could turn into a real trek for the fool, there was also the risk of running into a security guard first. Men as important as Robert Gibson certainly ensured that bodyguards were close to them and their loved ones 24 hours a day, every day. On the right side of the corridor a railing came into view, which belonged to a staircase that led to the ground floor of the house. A few meters further the corridor turned to the right. In the corner of the turning corridor, next to a small table on which an old-fashioned umbrella lamp stood, a stuffed fox caught the eye, in whose half-open mouth a partridge, also prepared, had been placed. They were probably two examples from Robert Gibson's collection of self-shot hunting trophies that had been preserved in this way by a taxidermist. What a passionate hunter saw as decorative might seem a little scary to other people. The scene depicted with preserved hunting carcasses elicited a malicious grin from the fool. Soon Robert Gibson would become the victim of a different kind of hunt. Just as the jack-in-the-box was about to continue on its way to the bend in the aisle, it suddenly stopped moving. His sense of living things told him that something was approaching from the other corridor. Quiet tapping, moving quickly in his direction across the carpeted floor, followed closely behind. A being approached him that could also sense his malicious presence and was guided in his actions by a wolfish protective instinct towards the Gibsons. Warned, the fool's right hand reached for a tiny weapon sheath attached to his left side. Fingers and palm wrapped around the hilt of a miniature dagger that fit snugly in the hand. Then he pulled out the weapon and held it in front of him, ready to fire. The blade was only a few centimeters long, but was as sharp as a razor. In addition, the dagger had a tip designed to penetrate flesh.